More than simply giving Salt Lake City its name, the lake has been entwined in the city's history, and it remains today integral to the history of the city and the state of Utah, to its culture, to its economy. Great Salt Lake is one of the main things that makes Utah and Salt Lake City a very special place. We are at the north end of Antelope Island, and we are looking at the Great Salt Lake between Antelope Island and the city of Ogden, essentially. The lake itself is a living remains of Lake Bonneville, the prehistoric lake that existed during the Pleistocene, that reached its maximum level about 16,000 years ago and then began to recede after an ice dam at the north end of the lake up here near the Idaho-Utah border collapsed. This is essentially a very shallow pan. And what I mean by that is that the depth of the lake is never very great. If you want to look over this way, we can look out to the west, actually, and that low dome is Carrington Island. The deepest part of Great Salt Lake sits between us and that point, about halfway. And now at medium to low lake levels, it's probably around 30 feet or less deep. The lake itself averages only 15 or 16 feet in depth. And looking a little bit down into the left over here at Bridger Bay, you can see the effect of that. And that is that with a very minimal change in lake levels, the surface area and therefore the shorelines of Great Salt Lake can change very radically and very quickly. The first inhabitants of this area, of course, were native peoples, and native peoples lived here as long ago, at least 10,000 years. And if we look back over this way, the prime resource for anyone living around Great Salt Lake were the wetlands along the eastern shore of the lake. The culture that was associated with this, with the lake when it reached its highest population was known as the Fremont culture. Fremont culture reached its peak about the same time as ancestral Puebloan culture, 900 to about 1300 AD, and that's when the population peaked here along the Wasatch Front. And the archaeological evidence indicates that the population of native people along the Wasatch Front did fall pretty precipitously after 1600, and probably due to the arrival of epidemic diseases brought by Europeans that were transferred through other native people. So it's long before any European actually set foot here or saw Great Salt Lake that the impact of those diseases was likely felt. The first Euro-Americans to arrive and to actually see Great Salt Lake is a matter of some dispute. We know that Fathers Dominguez and Escalante in 1776, when they were trying to find a route from Santa Fe to Monterey on the California coast to the missions, came as far north as Utah Lake, but never saw Salt Lake itself. That's 1776. After the Escalante expedition, there is a competing claim on who first, what Euro-American first saw Great Salt Lake. In 1824, Jim Bridger claims to have been the first to see Great Salt Lake, riding down from the Bear River Valley to the north here, the north end of the lake. But there's also pretty good evidence that Etienne Provost, a fur trapper operating out of Taos, was in the Salt Lake Valley earlier than that and may have been the first Euro-American to see the lake. Out there right now is Fremont Island. It's kind of masked by promontory, the larger peninsula, the larger mountain range behind it, but in the foreground is Fremont Island with the pinnacle, the summit, on the right side. Fremont Island was first explored in 1843 by John C. Fremont, the famous government explorer, on his second expedition. He and his party came down from Fort Hall from the north and wanted to get a look at the Great Salt Lake, and they had a very hard time getting a decent look at the lake because of that flat pan phenomenon where you can't get very close to it in many places. And so they finally attained to prominence over here by the modern city of Ogden, down by the Weber River, and were able to see the entire lake. They had brought with them an India rubber boat, which they inflated, and they paddled down the Weber River and out into the lake in early September 1843 and paddled out towards the island. They spent a night on the lake, climbed up to that prominence where Carson or one of the others carved a cross in the rock at the top, and that's still out there. He named the island Disappointment Island. And it's not named Fremont Island until the great survey of Captain Howard Stansbury in 1849, 1850. Well, we've moved down to the south end of the lake, and we're standing between the modern Salt Air and the Great Salt Lake State Park Marina. And we're going to talk a little bit about recreation. Great Salt Lake has always been a curiosity and an attraction to tourists, and it was no different in the 19th century. The original Mormon pioneers, shortly after arriving in the valley, made a reconnaissance out to the lake and bathed in the lake. It was famous as America's Dead Sea. Concerted development of a tourist industry didn't begin until the 1870s. The most famous resort of all, of course, was Salt Air, and what you see behind us here is the modern iteration of Salt Air. This building wasn't built until the early 1980s. The original Salt Air would have been out here. It was built on pilings, 2,500 pilings that extended 4,000 feet out into the lake. A major pavilion was built there with bathing facilities, and people simply descended stairs to a platform and then got into the water that way. It was built in this Moorish revival style, they called it, that evoked sort of this exotic Orientalism that was very popular in the late 19th, early 20th century. When visitors arrived, they would find there were rides, there was a game midway, but it was really the lake that was the attraction. The novelty of floating in Great Salt Lake, this idea of being able to float like a cork in this dense brine, and that remained a really big draw. But just like everything else out here, lake levels matter a lot. And over the years, even the Grand Salt Air, 4,000 feet out from the shore, would be stranded high and dry by the 1930s. By the time of the Great Depression and World War II, not as many people came out here, and it finally closed in 1958. And was burned completely in an arson fire in 1970. The building behind us was developed as a successor to that, and it was opened in 1981. And it had about a 2-year lifespan before it was swallowed by the lake. Beginning in September of 1983, Great Salt Lake went through one of the wettest cycle in its history. Lake levels started rising and peaked in 1986 and 1987 at about 4,212 feet, just a little bit below that, above sea level. In 1984, that building had 5 feet of water on the first floor. And so these people had invested, rebuilt the place, and it was destroyed almost immediately. The waters eventually did come down, and it was bought by other investors who, in the early 1990s, turned it into what it remains today, which is a concert venue. Great Salt Lake is the center of a great deal of industry, and it's very important economically to the state of Utah. Here at the south end of the lake, you can see pretty great evidence of that. What we're looking at there is a smelter for Kennecott Copper, Rio Tinto Corporation, today. And that is where the copper that is dug out of the Bingham Canyon mine is processed. The shoreline here along the south side is also the home to major mineral extraction. Salt extraction started very early in Utah's history. Even Fremont's men boiled lake water to get salt for their needs. To the west of here is Morton Salt's current operation, and there they produce salt that is used in commercial and industrial applications for water softeners, for other industrial applications for livestock, etc. Many other minerals are taken from the brine of Great Salt Lake, including sulfates of potassium, which is used in fertilizers, and U.S. Magnesium extracts magnesium metal, magnesium chloride, which is used to de-ice roadways and construction sites, and chlorine itself, and various other chemicals are extracted from the lake. Just as the rising and falling levels of the lake pose severe problems to resorts like Salt Air and the others, the same thing is true of the mineral industries. A rising lake could flood Salt Air, or a dropping lake could leave the beaches high and dry or far out to the horizon. The rise of the lake in the mid-1980s really endangered the mineral extraction industry because it flooded the evaporation ponds at places like US Magnesium and others, which relied upon solar radiation to evaporate water and therefore extract the minerals. Dealing with the natural rise and fall of the lake is something that is just a constant part of the history of this place. There are real concerns today that human impacts do make a difference. History, the evidence shows that the lake has risen and fallen. On the other hand, a lot of people who study the lake and know the lake the best today are very concerned about water issues and the fact that there is no water right that is inherent to Great Salt Lake, and there's no guarantee of a water supply to it to replenish it on an annual basis. So it's something that certainly people in the community are concerned with. Beyond giving Salt Lake City its name, the Great Salt Lake is intertwined with its history and with the history of all of Utah. Now in the early 21st century, it has been overshadowed in many ways by the mountains and by the grand national parks of Utah. But in the 19th century, it was a focus of tourism, of fascination. It was a focus of industries, of grazing, of mineral extraction. And so for all of those reasons, the lake was and remains an integral part of Utah's history.